This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hi, this is Deanna Saylor from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. I am the editor of Without Borders, Neurology's Global Health section. Today we have Gretchen Birbeck and Melody Asukile joining us. Gretchen is a professor of neurology at the University of Rochester and has spent much of her career studying cerebral malaria and seizures in people with HIV in Zambia and Malawi. Melody is an epileptologist at the University of Zambia School of Medicine in Lusaka, Zambia, and one of the first neurologists in Zambia. They are also lead authors of a recent paper published in JAMA Neurology titled The Perils and Pitfalls of Global Engagement. It was published online on January 2nd, 2024. Melody and Gretchen, our audience likely has varying degrees of familiarity with what is meant by the term global neurology, and they may or may not know anyone who has actually undertaken even short-term activities within the global neurology realm, let alone dedicated their careers to this area. Gretchen, could you start by telling us how you think about the term global neurology and also telling us a bit more about your work in Zambia and Malawi over the past 30 years?
In my view, global neurology, it's a discipline that incorporates neurological education, research, advocacy, and care delivery with the overall goal of improving neurologic health and health equity for all people. So it sort of inherently considers neurologic health of populations in a worldwide context. If you think about my definition, you really don't have to leave the US to apply global neurology principles to your work. But many of us do, since in reality, the burden of neurological disorders globally is greater in regions with the least neurologic expertise available. This reality, the chasm between neurologic burden of disease and neurological expertise, was first highlighted in the US in a report completed by the then Institute of Medicine, now National Academy of Medicine, in 2000 by Richard Johnson. And this report, along with the globalization of medicine, pushed along, in my view, by PEPFAR programs, has really transformed neurology in many settings over the last 30 years that I've been working. This includes opening up a lot of funding opportunities. The Fogarty International Center's Brain Disorders Across the Lifespan funding mechanism followed this initial NAMS publication, and the next decade or so really set the stage for many of the existing advances we're now seeing in neurology outside of high-income countries.
Thanks so much, Gretchen, for that perspective. You've had a lot of experience working in this field. But Melody, your perspective is likely to be unique from Gretchen's because we often define global neurology from the perspective of those coming from high-income countries. As a neurologist in a low-resource setting, how do you think of global neurology?
I share many of Gretchen's views on this one. So for me, I think of global neurology in two broad categories, really. So I think about it in terms of research and education and healthcare access. When we're talking about the practice of global neurology, either from international neurologists or local neurologists in my setting, I think it should focus on promoting research and education that is current but relevant for resource-limited settings. So this means that the interactions and the relationships should result in independent local researchers and neurologists whose impact on their society will continue long after the international support is gone. And similarly with international support of healthcare systems, I think these should be appropriate for the population and sustainable. So in short, I think global neurology should adapt and innovate based on the available resources in the place where they're being practiced.
In your article, you state most U.S. collaborations with lower middle income countries will include capacity building. And you further state, even in the context of genuine enthusiasm to improve care or foster scientific advancement, unintended consequences occur. You go on to share anecdotal experiences about such unintended consequences in the clinical, education, community, and research realms. Outside of those that are discussed within the article, I was hoping that maybe each of you would share an example of a collaboration you observed or were part of that started off with the best of intentions, but ended up having negative unintended consequences.
Wow, I really wish I didn't have so many good examples to choose from. So I'll give you one that I think it kind of exemplifies a lot of different challenges. I was working in a rural community when a faith-based organization came out with the purpose of rehabbing some of our dilapidated staff housing. So this was a real need, and I know this group really wanted to help. And the group arrived with about 30 people. For a small rural hospital, 30 people are a lot of people to house and to transport. So that was sort of an initial challenge. And then really out of those 30 people, only about 5 of them were engaged in the building project. Everybody else was either young and sort of teenage age. And for those individuals, we worried an awful lot because they had a lot of normal adolescent curiosity and they were spending days and nights out in the market area, which most people wouldn't have their teenagers out there at night. And then the other part of the 30 folks were older people, middle to late age, who hadn't had appropriate medical clearance before coming out. So they arrive and start having a lot of activity in terms of their chronic health diseases acting up. And so they seem to spend most of their time queued up in our clinics. So this was clearly not what the visitors had planned, but from our perspective, we suddenly had transport issues, housing issues, teenagers that we weren't responsible for, but we felt like we needed to watch closely, and then a deluge of external visitors clogging up our clinics. Then in addition, the planning of the building wasn't very well done, and the visitors actually left having taken the time to kind of take the housing apart but not put it back together. So previously habitable housing was no longer habitable. And they left the materials and instructions about what needed to be done with administration, which was obviously not ideal. So in this setting, we had a lot of struggles with everything from the time they visited until they left. And again, I'm sure they had good intentions, but it was a problem. And I think kind of the kicker to all of that was for those of us who knew what it costs to fly 30 people from America to this location, that funding alone could have built all new housing if that was really the goal. So thinking of your burden on local systems for transport and housing, being pragmatic about what you can actually do with the time available, recognizing that the project you want to do might be small financially compared to the amount you're going to spend to get out there, and thinking about those trade-offs. All of those are things and problems I've seen. This was an example where it was a real doozy. It all happened with one set of visitors. But I think that those types of problems we often see in well-meaning guests who arrive.
Wow, thanks, Gretchen, for sharing that example. Melody, do you have an example to share?
Yeah, I think for me, one example that always comes to mind when I think of well-meaning but poorly thought out collaborative efforts, it's usually when there's donation of previously used but functional diagnostic equipment. So at times, I think this is done without careful analysis of the expertise of the recipients to use the equipment, and there are no long-term plans with regards to servicing and software management. So usually after an institution has undergone this rigorous process of importing the equipment, it is soon discovered that no one is trained to use it. It requires regular purchase of consumable products and that are not available in the country. And also the machine service plans tend not to extend to the receiving country, and the software that the machines use is usually proprietary, so it doesn't allow for updates or modifications. So unfortunately, once these machines are finally received, they are often packed away because they are unusable. So I think it would be useful to consider sustainable plans for local machine service, long-term access to consumables, and at times those who are donating may find that aiding the institution in purchasing equipment that they're familiar with and they can actually use may actually be more cost-effective in the long run. So I think this is one example that I've seen or observed happening quite a lot. But then we do have some positive examples.
Melody, that's a perfect segue to my next question, because obviously you two wouldn't be doing this work if all of these collaborations worked out so negatively. And so now that we have highlighted kind of some unintended negative consequences when these collaborations are not well planned, I wondered if you could each give 1 or 2 examples of really excellent collaborations that you've witnessed or been a part of as well. And so, Gretchen, maybe we can start with you
Yeah,
again.
I think that's good timing because I completely agree with Melody's experience of donated equipment really not being such a gift at the end of the day. But I can tell you of one example in which we have just an excellent collaboration. Keith Morgan is a business entrepreneur in the US who actually initially trained as an EEG technologist, and now he owns a monitoring company that does medical monitoring in the US. And Keith has a lot of interest and expertise in global health, and he's really taken that skill set and the drive to understand local needs and managed to provide really invaluable support for a number of African countries related to expanding neurodiagnostic services for neurophysiologic studies. And what Keith has done, at least at our site, and I know a number of other countries, is first of all, he does help source equipment that's appropriate for the environment and will then organize getting that equipment to the site, which isn't always trivial. This is often equipment that's been donated by hospitals that are upgrading their system. And in the midst of that, there's just a lot of perfectly usable equipment that's kind of getting trashed. But he then takes it the next level. He appreciates that equipment isn't all that you need. Somebody needs to know how to use the equipment, so technologists, and read the studies, EEG interpreters. So he really, before he facilitates a donation, he wants to understand that whole pipeline, how it's going to happen, who's going to be doing the reports, what's the plan for consumables. And he not only wants to know that, but he'll help you think through those issues before sending donated equipment to a site. In addition, he's played a huge role in opening up opportunities for EEG technologists in different African countries to gain the expertise. The assumption is that there are some local expertise in place to help with hands-on activities, but he's played a major role in organizing access to training programs in the US that are virtual, as well as organizing appropriate local continuing professional development opportunities for people once he has had them trained. And I will say he also completely appreciates the role of the interpreter, and his question is always who's going to read these studies, because he has a good understanding that EEG technology is actually not a good thing in the hands of the wrong people if we have inexpert interpreters. So I think Keith has obviously seen it done wrong and decided to do it right, and he's figured out how to do it right and is actually doing that not only for Zambia, but he's played a role in Malawi, I know Ghana, a number of countries. So it can be done right, and just takes probably a lot more effort than simply donating a machine.
Thanks, Gretchen. It's nice to hear of that positive example from Keith. Melody, how about you?
I think the first thing I want to say is that in recent times, I can think of several excellent collaborations, which is really good. So it's important to note that many like us have become aware of some of the missteps of the past. And so it's refreshing to see that many neurological organizations are actually making that conscious effort to practice more equitably at a global level. So we mentioned this briefly in our paper, but for me, the Zambian Neurologist Training Program is a perfect example of a good global neurology education collaboration. So the collaboration between the Johns Hopkins University, led by you, Deanna, with the University of Zambia and the Ministry of Health, has not only created a self-sustaining, now 6 years old local neurology training program, but it has become a regional training center. And we now have 3 international neurology trainees. So it's so heartwarming to see how the trained are becoming the trainers, and the program is tailor-made for our setting while maintaining the currently worldwide accepted standards of care. So I think that's a perfect example for me.
I think the examples you've just given really highlight the potential for global neurology work and equitable collaborations and good consequences. And in your article, you list several important principles for successful partnerships, and these included ensuring appropriate supervision of trainees who travel to a new setting, creating truly bi-directional partnerships that are responsive to the host institution's identified needs, as well as the importance of in-country or within-region training for physicians in low and middle-income countries. And finally, the necessity of ensuring local investigators involved in research projects are fairly compensated, both from a monetary perspective, but also academically for the work that they put in. Besides your article, are there additional resources available for listeners who may be considering undertaking some global neurology-related work or who want to ensure they are minimizing unintended consequences of their work? Gretchen, maybe you can start us off?
to be really clear, having a local partner that you have a relationship with, which allows open and honest dialogue, is just foundational. And if you don't have that, you really don't have anywhere to go. That really has to be number 1, 2, and 3. I think in terms of tangible resources, if you're working in medical education, it would be really valuable for people to go to the paper that your team published on the consensus competencies for postgraduate fellowship training in global neurology. I think that paper isn't just applicable to postgraduate fellowships, but many of the principles would be applicable for pretty much any medical education activity. And then finally, if people are looking for partners, they're looking for partners or locations. Today, most of our professional societies in the U.S. have some, either global health interest group or international outreach group or something. And that entity will undoubtedly include people who have ongoing activities and partnerships that can either link you up with someone or provide you with some guidance. So you don't have to just slog through the internet and hope you find a decent partner. Your professional societies will have active individuals that can offer guidance as well.
Thanks, Gretchen. That's great advice. Melody, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think totally agree with everything Gretchen has said. So just to add some specific examples, I know right now the American Neurological Association, they have the International Outreach Fellowship, which is for early career neurologists and trainees to give them exposure to neurology practice and research in low middle income countries. So that's usually open around this time of the year and it's open for application. I think the World Federation of Neurology is also a great resource for international collaboration. So those are some examples, as Gretchen mentioned, of professional societies where you can actually get links into global neurology activities.
And the American Academy of Neurology also has the Global Health section that has monthly webinars and other resources. And there's links to those pages on our Without Borders page as well. So those are a lot of great resources. And maybe, Gretchen, we've heard about the many positive outcomes and great things that can come from involvement in global neurology. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on structural barriers to U.S. academic involvement in global neurology that may be preventing more people from being involved.
Absolutely. And I think about those structural barriers under kind of 3 broad categories. So first, from a research perspective, there is a real challenge in terms of appropriate grants management. And by that, I mean appropriate grants management on the U.S. side and the foreign side. Now, the foreign side is largely an issue of just some capacity building, recognizing that the indirect costs provided by most funders won't even begin to help an African entity develop a research office and fund it. That's a major challenge. 8% indirect costs will not come close to allowing an African university to have a functioning research office for grants management issues. So that is a major challenge. I know this has been brought up to Fogarty, and I know that they're thinking about it, but I have yet to see a solution in terms of funding those activities. And sadly enough, despite the reality that our U.S. institutions have very highly skilled, sophisticated grants management and finance offices, for many, especially in neurology and not in infectious diseases, those are extremely limited in terms of their understanding of the nuances, but critical nuances that administering grants in the U.S. setting versus, foreign subcontracts and all that entails. And you could have a bazillion-dollar grant, but if you cannot move $1 from the U.S. to your foreign site, you don't have any money at all to work with. From an educational perspective, for the U.S. trainees, I think the commonest challenge amongst neurology residents are leadership that believe because there's ACGME funding, people can't do rotations abroad during their residency. That's absolutely not true. The only time that's a potential challenge is if every single slot in the residency is ACGME funded. And then you can make an argument that sending someone abroad for a rotation is problematic. But I think most programs have more than just those ACGME funded slots. And then from a clinical perspective, you have regulatory issues related to licensure. I think we can all appreciate that if a foreign physician showed up at our hospital in America and just decided to start seeing patients, we'd probably call security. I think it's reasonable to have that same perspective when people come here, and yet often people don't think about that, or it's difficult on the foreign side to, in an expedited fashion, get someone credentialed appropriately. Similarly, very highly trained physicians can arrive into a place where there are clinical conditions they've never seen before that may not even be on their differential. And this is where it becomes very important to partner with local physicians who do know those conditions, and to also do your homework before you land in the field so that you have an idea of the things you might see that you've never seen before.
Great. Very sage advice, Gretchen. Thank you for bringing all of those aspects to light as well. For our final question, I'd like to ask you both, and Melody, maybe you can go first. What is the one piece of advice you would give listeners who want to get involved in global neurology and want to make sure they're doing it in the best way possible with the best consequences possible?
So I think the one piece of advice I would give on both sides is to have a bi-directional mindset. So I think you should come in with the attitude of being willing to listen and learn as much as you're willing to give. So a lot of times people feel they are coming to just give and share their knowledge. But I think being willing to understand that you have also come to get something out of it, so that it's a two-way street. It's benefits from both sides. I think that's very key in a successful collaboration.
I can't add to that, because that is the one take home that I would love everyone listening to sort of have sink in. But one of the pieces about a bi-directional partnership is that you can't arrive on site or reach out to your partner with some very hardwired plans about what you're going to do, whether it's research or clinical care. If you're too hardwired, it may not actually meet local needs. So being more open and thinking about what you have to offer, and then allowing your partner and you together to figure out how to maximize that, is far more important than coming with some fully developed canned project and thinking that that's going to be successful when it hasn't really had appropriate consultation at the local site.
Thanks, Gretchen, and thanks, Melody. Those were great thoughts. This has been an incredibly interesting conversation. To learn more about Gretchen and Melody's recommendations for engaging positively in the global neurology space, their paper was published online in JAMA Neurology on January 4th. I'm Deanna Saylor, and I've been joined today by Gretchen Birbeck and Melody Asukile. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today, and please join us again soon for the next Neurology podcast.
This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review the Neurology Podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can always head to neurology.org/podcast for our full list of past episodes. Or you can also search by keyword in your podcast app for any neurology-specific topics you want to learn about.